if you've taken an intro philosophy class, or if you've taken even the ethics class that Highland offers, um, you should be a step ahead here. You should be in a good position to understand ethics, but might not necessarily. So um, keep an open mind is, I guess, what I'm going to say. I guess that's the diplomatic way to put it. Don't assume you already know this. Right. Don't assume you already know this. And if you've never taken a philosophy class or an ethics class, well, then you don't have to worry about it. You really don't have to worry about that. It's You obviously don't know it. So when we're talking about media ethics, we're going to talk about ethics in the broader sense and then apply it to media, because it's not that there's a specific philosophical venture out there just for media ethics. It's how do we apply ethical standards to media type situations. And so we're going to walk through some of the approaches to ethics that we can use in the media environment. And the first is what we call virtue ethics. Virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is ethics based upon individual choice, right? The next unit we're going to talk about is media law, right? And when we talk about law, we're going to talk about, you know, governmental consequence, right? We're going to talk about civic consequence to things. When we're talking about ethics, there's no real consequence, right? The consequence here is social. If you violate ethics, you don't get put in prison, but you do get judged harshly, right? There are social consequences for that, but not legal consequences for it. So when we're talking about virtue ethics, we're talking about the individual choice is the guiding factor here, right? What's ethical is the individual, right? So you could summarize virtue ethics by just do what's right. Just do the right thing, which is something you've probably heard multiple times from parents and from authority figures, right? It's something I say to my kids all the time. Just, the right thing to do, just do it, right? But the emphasis here, the impetus is placed on the individual to make the best decision based on their gut, right? There's no clear, simple rubric you can use. There's no objective standard for this is the right thing to do. It's just, it, right? You listen to your gut, listen to your conscience, as it were. One of the classic examples of virtue ethics is the golden rule, which, again, is kind of ingrained in our culture from a very early age in people. Right? The golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And again, this relies on intuition, right? It requires the person to kind of have that intuitive, how would I want to be treated? Okay, so that's how I should treat other people. Well, if I don't mind people spitting on me, then that means I'm allowed to spit on other people, and that's maybe not what some people would consider ethical. And so, virtue ethics, while it's very simplistic, it's very basic, and I think that's why a lot of people kind of lean to it. It also has some very clear flaws once you try to apply it. And what good are ethics if they're not applied? Right. Another variance on this is what's called the golden mean, and this is a concept that Aristotle talked about at great length in his writings. Um, Aristotle believed that the virtuous thing, right, the proper thing, was always in the middle. Right. We should always aim for moderation. And this is a concept that in recent times has been really abused. uh, I think, to put it lightly. The idea that, moderation is always best, the middle is always best. Eh. I think if you're looking at hate crimes, I don't think there's a moderate level of hate crimes. I don't think we can really apply the golden mean when it comes to the KKK. I think there's a pretty clear right and a pretty clear wrong. I don't know if there's a moderation we should be looking for. Uh, and again, this is kind of the challenge we face. We deal with virtue ethics, is that we want to believe people are virtuous. We want to believe that everybody has those angels of their better nature that can be appealed to and that they can listen to. But we know for a fact that that's not the case. Everyone who can hear my voice right now knows a scumbag. Everyone who can hear my voice right now knows somebody in their life who just does shady shit. they're just that person. So the idea that we can appeal to individuals to be better, and we can appeal to individuals to do the right thing, right? As we apply this specifically to media, uh, this is really, I think where a lot of our distrust of the media comes from is we tend to, again, with all human beings, with all people, we tend to assume that they could do the right thing, they know the right thing to do. And so when they don't comply by what we consider to be the right thing to do, we think, oh, well, they're obviously biased, they're obviously, you know they're part of the problem because they're not doing what I would want them to do. Well, that's not a fair standard. It's just simply not a fair standard. you know um, do the right thing. The example I like to use in this instance is, if the president of Highland Community College put out a statement that was just an obvious falsehood, right? That was just an obvious untrue thing, right? It was provably, demonstrably a lie. The right thing to do is to call out a lie, right? Isn't that what you would do in your daily life? Is you would call out a lie if somebody tells you something that is obviously untrue? Don't you have an obligation to tell them that that's not true? But as a journalist, the right thing to do there isn't necessarily the right thing to do for your stakeholders, right? Calling out a lie isn't necessarily going to be better for your employer. So do the right thing doesn't really give you a lot of comfort. It doesn't give you a lot of guidance, right? So, virtue ethics is maybe not the right way to go in the world of media, um, in the world of journalism, in the world of entertainment media, and the world of advertising. The right thing, by whose standard, right? Which leads us to another option, and that's what we call duty ethics, right? Duty, duty, duty ethics is an obligation to follow the rules, right? There are rules that are in place for what you're doing. Your obligation is to follow them, period. You see a version of duty ethics expressed quite a bit when people say, "Oh, just follow the law," right? Just follow the law. Just do what the law says. Hmm, laws can be unjust, right? But duty ethics argues, it implies, it automatically assumes that laws are just and that rules are just, right? Duty ethics is the idea that you do what you're supposed to. You do what you are supposed to. The old moral conundrum, the old moral problem that people, is it wrong to steal to feed a starving child? Well, if you're a duty ethicist, yes, it is. It's really simple. The law is clear. Stealing is wrong. Thus, stealing is unethical, no matter what your ends are, no matter what you're doing it for. One of the applications of duty ethics is a concept called the categorical imperative. And this is an idea that was put forward by German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And it's very important that you pronounce his name properly. It is Kant. Immanuel Kant argued that the categorical imperative means that it is the thing that uh, must be accomplished. Right? It is an imperative of category. It must be accomplished. So Kant argued that to determine if something is moral, to determine if something is just, to determine if something is ethical, then uh, it must be something that anyone in your position would do, right? anyone in the same position as you would do it, thus it is ethical to do. So you can consider your actions ethical. You can consider your actions just if you believe that anybody else would do the same thing. There's also a school of thought in duty ethics called discourse ethics. And discourse ethics kind of acknowledges that uh, ethics are situational, right? That ethics are based upon the discourse you're engaged in. What's ethical in a newsroom isn't going to be ethical in a police station, and vice versa. Right? What's ethical in public relations might not be ethical in teaching, and vice versa. Because again, your obligation here is to follow the rules of your field. So I mean, I mentioned PR. Let's look at PR and discourse ethics as a matter of duty ethics. Right? What's your job in PR? Your job is to promote the brand, right? To make your client look good. What if your client is Michael Vick, right? For those of you who don't remember, Michael Vick was the quarterback in the NFL who was arrested for a massive dogfighting ring, right? He's now a commentator for Fox Sports, I believe. So, worked out for him. But um, what if your client is a convicted pedophile? I, if you're a duty ethicist, then your responsibility is to make that convicted pedophile more appealing to the general public. How, I mean, does anybody feel comfortable saying it's ethical to make a convicted pedophile look good? I have a hard time believing that. I have a hard time thinking that. Right? Yeah, this is one of the challenges that lawyers get into quite a bit is as a lawyer, you are not only ethically bound, but legally bound to defend your client to the best of your abilities. They have a legal requirement to do it. For the rest of us, duty ethics just says, no, you have a social responsibility to do it. Right? Like if I work in PR and I don't do the best job possible for my client, I don't go to jail. But I also lose my client and I lose the respect of my colleagues and I lose potential future earnings. And, so the consequences aren't jail time, but there are certainly consequences for it. Same with advertising. We've known that cigarettes are bad for you for almost 100 years, right? I mean, we've known that smoking cigarettes leads to cancer for decades, for a very long time. In my lifetime, it was still very common to see ads for cigarettes. Not so much in your lifetime, right? The laws changed and now it is illegal to advertise cigarettes, but I remember very clearly growing up seeing ads for Marlboro and Camel and Newport everywhere. And the people who made those ads knew they were promoting a product that kills people. They knew that they were, making advertisements that targeted underage smokers. They knew it. They knew for a fact they were making ads to convince young people to smoke. By normal societal standards, that's horrible. It's horrible. If I, as an individual, just hung out on a middle school playground and started talking up how awesome cigarettes were to kids, I'd be a monster. No one would hesitate to say I'm a horrible person. But if it's my job to do it, suddenly it's different. If I'm getting paid to do something you would otherwise consider monstrous, it's now virtuous because it's what I was supposed to do. Yeah, it's I, ironically, Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher who was actually cited quite a bit by the Nazi Party. And after World War II, when the so many SS officers and Nazi officials were put on trial for war crimes in Nuremberg, what came to be known as the Nuremberg defense was employed quite often, where when these officers were being questioned and they were asked, how could you do this? Why did you do these awful things? How could you have committed these atrocities? And the Nuremberg defense that they referred to over and over again was, I was ordered to do so. It's because they told me to. I was just doing what I was told. Right. And that is discourse ethics. That is duty ethics as lived. If you're a duty ethicist, you've got to accept that the people who committed war crimes, the people who committed genocide were just doing what they were told. So it's not their fault. I'm not here to judge you. I'm just saying I have a hard time squaring that circle. Consequence ethics is another school of thought you can apply when it comes to media ethics and media ethicists. Consequence ethics is the idea that you have an obligation to do the right thing based on the results, right? All's well that ends well, right? The idea that you do what works. If it works, it's good. If it gets the results you wanted, it was the right thing to do. So, should you steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving child? Well, ultimately, what you're doing is more good than harm. So, yes, you're feeding a starving child. You're stopping a child from dying. So, yes, it is the right thing to do. Right? That's consequence ethics. One of the most well-known applications of consequence ethics is a concept called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that you can determine what is good and what is bad. You can determine what is just or what is unjust by whether or not it does more good for more people. Does it help more people than it harms? If it helps more people than it harms, it is good. If it hurts more people than it helps, it is bad. It's that simple. That simple. Doesn't matter what the behavior is. Doesn't matter what the action is. Does it help people? And if it helps more than it hurts, you have an obligation to do it. Then you should do it. You're morally bound to do it. If murdering 10 people saves the lives of 1,000, do it. If going back in time and murdering baby Hitler will save 6 million Jews, do it. It's math, right? Utilitarianism tries to break ethics down into a very simple math equation. Another take on consequence ethics is called the veil of ignorance. And this is a lesser known ethical theory, but I find it fascinating. I think it should be one of those standards that's taught in every ethics class. But the veil of ignorance was developed by a philosopher named John Rawls. And the basic premise here is that you should make all decisions as if you have no idea who will be affected. And it's called the veil of ignorance because it's supposed to be, invoke the imagery of a veil over your face, right? If you're wearing a veil, right, very thin fabric, very thin material, you can see shapes, but you can't see details. Right. So if I had a veil over my eyes, I could see people in front of me, but I couldn't tell you who they were. I couldn't tell you, what gender they were. I couldn't tell you what their sexual orientation was. I couldn't tell you what their race or ethnicity was. I would only know person, right? So the veil of ignorance says that you should make all decisions as if you have no idea who's going to be affected by it. And that will help you determine if it's the right thing to do. it's kind of a thought experiment here, but the thought experiment is really simple. If you know that any decision you make could hurt someone you love, you will be more cautious in making that decision, right? It's really easy to say, yes, do this dangerous thing if it happens to somebody you've never met. But that same decision becomes incredibly difficult if it could potentially hurt someone you love or even yourself. And so Rawls devised this little thought experiment to say, okay, you want to release this chemical into the air. Before you determine whether or not that's a just decision, that's the right thing to do, you don't know if that chemical in the air could end up harming or killing someone you love, right? Would you still make the same decision? So again, based on the outcome here, it's based on the results. Even if it hurts somebody you love, would you be willing to do it? Even if the people affected included yourself, would you still be willing to do it? And that's the only true way to determine ethical behavior. Is the outcome is what really matters, not who the outcome happens to. Hopefully, as you could pick up from the description here, there are some real problems with consequence ethics as well. It's not a perfect system. None of them are. Consequence ethics has its own special challenges, its own dilemmas that we have to overcome if we're going to utilize such a philosophy, such an idea. I mean, is it on the one hand saying, okay, if I kill these 10 people, it will save the lives of 1,000? Sure, that seems simple enough, but only if you extract the idea that those are people who have their own lives, who have their own families, who have their own value. I mean, on paper saying, sure, kill 10 people so that you can save 100. Of course, that makes sense mathematically, but those 10 people have names. Those 10 people have families. Those 10 people have dreams. Those 10 people have a have a life. Is it comforting to them to know that they're saving 100 people? Is it comforting to their family to know they're saving 100 people? Again, Rawls would say, what would you do? If I came to you and said, hey, I need to kill your family to save 100 people. How ethical is that decision going to feel to you? How just is that going to feel to you? So while consequence ethics has a comfort to it, and that it is just simple, uh, objective decision making, God, the application is so dirty, so messy. You know, one of the cases you can look at, and one of the cases we're going to talk about in the history of kind of landmark events in media was what are called the Pentagon Papers, and a man named Daniel Rosenberg, who Nixon called the most dangerous man in America, which is really funny because he's the most unassuming human being you'll ever meet in your life. Like I've seen toddlers that are more physically imposing than Daniel Rosenberg. But Daniel Rosenberg worked for the Pentagon in the 1960s and 1970s, and he discovered that um, the Nixon White House had been deliberately bombing civilians in the Vietnam War. He discovered documents that the Nixon White House had been deliberately bombing not just civilians, but civilians outside of Vietnam. He'd been bombing Laos, he'd been bombing Cambodia, he'd been bombing the neighboring countries, and he did it knowingly. He knew he was committing war crimes. Well, did I say Rosenberg? Daniel Ellsberg. What the hell am I doing? Wow, Daniel Ellsberg. Where Rosenberg? Daniel Ellsberg discovered these documents and thought, this is wrong. People need to know about this. And so Daniel Ellsberg proceeded to, for the next several days and weeks, sneak those documents out of the White House, or excuse me, out of the Pentagon, and make copies of them. So he made copies of all of these documents that proved that our government had been committing atrocities. And once he had all the documents copied, he leaked them to the Washington Post. Well, first to the New York Times and then to the Washington Post. And the Post, doing their duty, doing their due diligence, meeting their ethical standards, notified the Pentagon that they had these documents and they were going to print them, and they wanted comment. They wanted to give the Pentagon the ability to comment before they ran the story. Well, the Pentagon sued them and said, you can't print that, right? It's a matter of national security. You're not allowed to print that. It will harm American interests abroad if you do this. Daniel Ellsberg, and then ultimately the Supreme Court, had to decide who was more harmed here. The American people, by having been lied to for years and years and years, or the government. Was the government going to be unduly harmed by having this information made public? Ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Washington Post. They ruled in favor of Ellsberg and said that those papers could be published because the greater good was in full transparency. Right? There was more harm done by lying than by being exposed. And so the court made a utilitarian decision. They made a consequentialist decision, which, again, as you'll find when you start doing your research on your media law cases, is not uncommon. It's very often kind of justified and defended as a consequentialist position of more harm would be done by voting the other way. Relativism is another concept of ethics that I think gets kind of a bad name. I'm not saying it's great, but it definitely isn't the horrible thing that a lot of people kind of immediately try to make it out to be. Relativism is the idea that ethics and ethical decisions can only be judged by the user. Right? In other words, you can't judge me based on your ethical position. You have to judge me based on my ethics. Relativism is the idea that the only bad thing is hypocrisy, right? It's not unethical for me to do just because you don't like it. It has to violate my own ethical standards to be unethical. Relativism acknowledges that people have different belief systems. People have different value systems. People have different ethical codes. And it's unfair to judge everyone by one standard. And again, it gets a bad rap. A lot of people say that, oh, moral relativism is the collapse of a nation. It's horrible. It's terrible. It does all the da 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 da. Well, you all rely on it, though. You all absolutely rely on moral relativism to get through your daily lives, because we condemn moral relativism when it's somebody not condemning an action we dislike, but we depend on moral relativism when we do something that other people don't like. we all suck. We're all hypocritical messes of humanity. I've never met a person who hated moral relativism but didn't absolutely depend on it. Because it's easy to dismiss. It's easy to say, "Oh, well, that's not right. That murder is wrong, no matter where you're from, no matter what your beliefs are. Murder is wrong." Well, you don't even believe murder is wrong. You don't even think murder is wrong. Everyone finds a way to justify murder. Everyone. You don't think of it as justifying murder, but it's what you're doing, right? And unless you're a Janist, right? Unless you believe that all violence is wrong, regardless of circumstance, you're a moral relativist. If someone breaks into my house, do I have the right to shoot them? I mean, some will say yes, some will say no. Am I justified in shooting that person? If you think the answer is yes, well, you're justifying, you're condoning murder. Oh no, it's different. It's different because they committed a crime. They weren't endangering my life. I wasn't protecting myself or my family. I was mad because they trespassed. Trespassing? That's a capital offense. It doesn't depend on why they broke into my house, Adam. If they broke into my house and weren't threatening anybody, they were just taking my stuff. I mean, would I be mad? Fuck yeah, I'd be mad. But if you think that it's acceptable to kill someone in that circumstance, then there you go. You're a relativist. If you think it's acceptable to beat a woman for not listening to you, if you think it's not acceptable to beat a woman for not listening to you, and you think that no matter where you're from or what's going on or what the circumstances are, it is wrong, 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 wrong. Unless you're an extreme absolutist, you're a relativist. So stop giving it such a bad name. Now that doesn't mean it's good, right? That's not me defending that belief system. That's not me defending relativism. I'm saying, what if they were your neighbor trying to escape from a criminal and knew you had a gun? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is like, if my neighbor broke into my house to escape a criminal, why would I shoot them? The neighbor or the criminal? Why would I feel justified in murdering them? And again, if you do, that's fine. If you do, that's fine. That's your morality. That's your belief system. That's your ethics. That's fine. Relativism is just the idea that you can't judge me by your own ethical standard, right? So conversely, I can't judge you. If you think it is justified to kill someone for breaking and entering, relativism says that I should not judge you as right or wrong in that decision, so long as it's consistent. So long as you are consistent in that belief, then you do you, boo. Right? The basic concept of relativism is do what you believe to be right, and that other people shouldn't judge you for what you believe to be right. And you shouldn't judge others for what they believe to be right. Which again, sounds nice and sounds really, really troublesome in other ways. There is a split, though. There is a difference between what we call individual relativism and cultural relativism. Individual relativism is the idea that the individual sets their own standards for what is right and wrong, what is just and unjust, what is moral and immoral, right? The person, the singular. Cultural relativism is the idea that the cultures you belong to, they hold the standards. You don't get to make your own rules. When I was growing up, again, being markedly older than you all, when I was growing up, there wasn't much of a public debate about spanking. Spanking was just considered moral, period. Were there people who thought spanking was wrong? Absolutely. But it wasn't really a public discussion. It wasn't really much debate on it. It was just, by and large, the culture believed that it was moral and just to spank a child. That has changed. Society no longer considers it moral to spank a child. With, again, there are people who still do, there are people who still believe it is fine, but the culture has determined that it is wrong to do, even though there are individuals who have determined it is not wrong to do. And relativism says that you can judge them for not abiding by the culture, the standards of their culture, but you can't judge them for not abiding by their own, right? If that's their belief, that's their belief. Right. And there are the extreme examples of this. There are the extreme instances of, like honor killings, right? Where, is it morally defensible to kill your child for disgracing you? But there's also much simpler, much less explosive, I guess, issues to look at relativism, like vegetarianism. Is it my kids love TikTok. My kids love TikTok. And there's apparently a user on TikTok called the vegan teacher, who is this middle-aged woman who talks about why everybody should be vegan. And my kids are constantly laughing at these videos that are just making fun of her and attacking her and, talking about what an idiot she is, right? And for me, I'm not vegan. I never will be vegan. I don't have a moral qualm with eating meat. I don't. Um, but I also don't think you need to attack somebody for that. I don't think that mocking someone for their veganism is necessary either. I think it's immoral to do that. And as such, that makes me a relativist. Right? If you believe in live and let live, then you're kind of a moral relativist. Um, I'm an individual relativist in that sense. Our culture, American culture, says that eating meat is not immoral, that eating meat is okay. But individually, you can make that judgment for yourself, and that's fine. I've never understood that. I've never understood why people get mad about that. Like, I can understand why somebody who, like, if you're a militant vegan, if you believe that meat is murder, I can understand why you would get upset at somebody eating a steak. I get that. I disagree with you, but I get why you would be upset. I don't understand why somebody who does eat meat gets mad at somebody who doesn't. Just don't get it. Like, why do you need to tell people how to live their life? I don't understand that, but I guess I'm a really bad American. I don't know. I'm a really bad white man. I know that much. I'm a terrible white man. I suck at all parts of being a white man. I need to get more impressive, I guess. So, all right. Well, it is 10:46, so we'll go ahead and wrap it today. Hopefully, I won't be quite as rambly on Wednesday, but I don't know. I might be. There's a good chance I'll be hungover as hell on Wednesday. Just FYI. Tomorrow's going to be a very stressful day for me. I am going to be